So a complete list of Star Trek uniforms is going to include a lot of uniforms, because after all, there's been a lot of Star Trek over the years. But once you isolate the central kind of classic lineup, you'll find that you've got something a little easier, even for a newcomer, to process and get your head around, because there's really only 4 of the really classic standard Star Trek uniforms. So what I want to do in this video is I want to talk about all of them, but to keep things tidy, I'm going to start with that short list and then kind of build up the longer list around it as we go. So the short list we've got here consists of the classic 23rd century Star Trek original series uniforms, and then 3 different variations of the 24th century design that began with Star Trek The Next Generation. So first off, that classic original Star Trek uniform from the original series back in the late 60s, which consists of black pants and a colored top, which represents the person's department, such as command or security, etc. The use of these bright primary colors was probably significantly influenced by the fact that color TV was kind of a novelty at the time, so you kind of want to have your use of colors to be impossible to miss. But while it may have initially been more about just showing off the color TV feature there, it kind of became a lasting legacy for all of Star Trek, because now most of us, or myself at least, a lot of us tend to think of Star Trek uniforms as being at their most authentic, being characterized by some version of these strong red, yellow, and blue primary colors. This became such a standard part of the Star Trek look and identity that some variation of it lasts through almost all of Star Trek, though it's definitely easier to miss it in, let's say, Discovery or Wrath of Khan. So in this first design for the classic TOS era with Kirk and the gang back in the late 60s, these stripes on your sleeve represent your rank, such as captain or lieutenant, and the color of your shirt reflects your department, with yellow being for command or navigation, blue for science or medical, and red for engineering or security. And then infamously, the term red shirt has come to refer to those poor doomed security officers who go off on away missions and end up getting killed, though ironically in some of the first episodes in the series, such as the Man Trap, those poor doomed fellows actually wore yellow, but heck, they're still red shirts. Next up, as we move into the return to television in the late 80s with The Next Generation, we get a new uniform. We're back to the multicolored tops after the movie era where everybody wore red, but now the meaning of the colors has adjusted just a little bit, with red and yellow being switched, so now the captain wears red. And more importantly, now the top of everybody's shirt is black, just like their pants and boots. Your color still represents your department, but the rank is shown on your collar by the number of rank pips instead of by stripes on your sleeve. And instead of having the Starfleet emblem embroidered onto your shirt, you instead wear a magnetic communicator badge, or comm badge as they came to be called, which is removable and which takes the place of the Kirk-era flip-top communicators. Moving into the 90s, we have the redesign that was developed for Deep Space Nine and was also used for the film Generations and for all of Star Trek Voyager. And some of us just refer to these uniforms as the Voyager uniforms, because Voyager is the only series in which they basically use these uniforms for the entirety of the series, because this crew was stuck in the Delta Quadrant and they never got those updated gray ones that came out next. So these Voyager uniforms are almost exactly the same as the TNG uniforms that we just looked at, except that the colored part and the black part of the shirt have been swapped, with the end result of it looking less, shall we say, less colorful. The color scheme for the departments is the same, the rank pips are the same, the comm badge works the same, though it's been redesigned to look a little more sleek and boxy. And then, moving along further into the 90s, the next classic redesign made things even one step less primary color focused, this time by replacing the colored top with a really nice textured gray top. And the department colors are now relocated to the undershirt poking up under the collar. Everything else is exactly the same: rank pips, comm badge, the meaning of the department colors, etc. I personally think that these are the best looking of the classic uniforms, and I think the reason for that is because these uniforms mark the final stage of the evolution of that design. And by keeping the strong yellows and reds into low profile, it ends up feeling more serious and real life than the rest of the classic Trek uniforms that we know and love. So this uniform was designed for the 8th Star Trek film, First Contact, which is why we usually call them the First Contact uniforms, but they're also strongly associated with Deep Space Nine, which used them for the second half of the series. And as well on Star Trek Voyager, whenever Voyager would phone back home to Starfleet, the fellows back home would be wearing these nice new gray top uniforms. Anyway, so that's really the full lineup right here. We got the TOS design and the 3 TNG derivatives, including the actual original TNG style, then the Voyager style, and the First Contact style uniform. And it's kind of like if a newcomer wants to know what Star Trek uniforms look like, these 4 are pretty much really the answer to the question. And it's kind of a nice, convenient, and tidy short list to have in your head that's really easy to get your head around and really does include the designs that end up being the most recognizable as Star Trek over the course of the franchise. But of course, for those who are more interested, we can go on adding some more interesting details and links in the chain. And the first step for that is going to be to add a couple more that actually should be there, even though they don't fit in quite as well. So the first step is going to be to have a slightly fuller list by adding the Wrath of Khan uniforms between TOS and TNG, and adding the Star Trek Enterprise uniforms at the very end, and also after that the Discovery uniforms, which are after the long gap. So the Wrath of Khan uniforms were the main TOS movie era uniforms, if you want to call them that, since most of us pretty quickly forget about the drab-looking uniforms from the first film, Star Trek the Motion Picture. Anyway, so the Wrath of Khan uniforms were introduced in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and lasted through till Star Trek VI and Generations. In a way, they feel like a bit of a departure since they are all one color and they have a bit of a more military vibe to them. They have metal badges, kind of like what we're going to get in the Next Generation, but these ones aren't comm badges. At this point, they're still using standard TOS-style communicators, not even the wrist communicators like they had in the motion picture. And it seems like, I guess you're supposed to pull down that white flap in red alert situations, maybe, or something like that. I really don't know. But anyway, and believe it or not, even though all of these shirts are red, and that's what you notice right off, but they actually do still have department colors. According to Wikipedia, departments are indicated by the color of the shoulder strap, armband, and undershirt. White for command, gold for engineering, gray for science, communications, and navigation, etc., light green for medical, etc. Now, for myself personally, I'm really not a super big fan of these uniforms. They kind of seem to me to be part of the aesthetic that accompanied the films Star Trek 2 through 6. For example, the darker interior redesign of the Enterprise. But I know a lot of people really love these uniforms and really associate them with classic Star Trek. And more importantly, perhaps the biggest reason you can't dismiss them is because these uniforms became the go-to retro uniform for time travel sequences looking backward. So young Captain Picard wore this uniform in the episode The Tapestry. The crew of the Enterprise B and C wore these uniforms. Young Tuvok wore this uniform in the Voyager episode Flashback. Wesley Crusher's dad wore this uniform in his recorded message for his son, etc. So even though this particular design isn't a personal favorite of mine, and even though it does interrupt the continuity of the classic colored tops, it's definitely not something you can just forget about, and it has a proud and very important role in the Star Trek saga as really one of the most long-running uniform in the in-universe timeline. Anyway, then we've got the Star Trek Enterprise uniforms, introduced in 2001, introduced with the launch of that new prequel series. And these ones aren't so much supposed to be in continuity from the First Contact uniforms as much as they're supposed to look like a development from NASA uniforms. And I think one thing they do accomplish is that they make the whole series of Star Trek Enterprise feel a lot more real world and kind of grounded in reality, less of the magical fantasy kind of feeling, whereas you can see that as good or bad, depending how you look at it. Probably one of the biggest reasons for that is that the colorful aspect of the classic uniforms is almost entirely gone. These uniforms kind of look like something we could picture people wearing in some part of real life. And the only multicolored part that remains is that the stripes indicate your department, and those stripes match the color scheme actually from the original series. And like a lot of Star Trek Enterprise, the design looks to me kind of like it's more of a conscious merger based on the more recent Star Trek of the time, the 24th century Star Trek, rather than from TOS era Star Trek. And in the case of the uniforms, you kind of see that when you look at the lines near the top of the uniform, which definitely remind you of where the colored top would be on the Voyager uniforms or the gray top of the First Contact uniforms. And also another way to think about how this seems to follow the preceding uniforms is that the Enterprise uniforms kind of pick up where the First Contact uniforms left off in terms of how we have kind of been gradually shrinking how much of the uniform belonged to the department color ever since the TOS uniforms. And then definitely making the uniform blue is a bit of a departure. I think the blue looks decently good. It's not a striking blue like in Discovery, but rather a kind of down-to-earth sort of blue that isn't supposed to look striking, but instead to look kind of unnoticeable, mundane, and not particularly futuristic, kind of like the rest of the aesthetic on Star Trek Enterprise. And in my opinion, they really succeeded in that. For me, watching Star Trek Enterprise, it doesn't nearly as much give me that magical stardust fantasy feeling like when I plug in the original series or Voyager, but instead gives me kind of a feeling of something that's a little more real and possible and down to earth. And of course, watching it now in 2025, it also feels very early 2000s with their computer screens and their PDAs and everything else, which I think is great fun as well. And these Enterprise uniforms also kind of remind me a little bit of the landing party uniforms that were used in the unaired pilot The Cage, just in the aspect of both of these feel kind of like something that's very down to earth and kind of ordinary, unimpressive, and kind of having a rugged quality about it, and something that I could kind of picture people wearing in some kind of ordinary, real life type of context. All right, and then there's one more major contribution to add to this collection, which needs to be listed at this point, even though it's not part of the classic lineup per se, and that's the Discovery uniform. Introduced in 2017 after the Star Trek franchise had been asleep for over 10 years, I think these good-looking blue uniforms really do a great job coming up with a completely new take that still somehow feels kind of Star Trek-ish. And just like with the Enterprise uniforms, we can see the evolution best not by comparing it to its contemporaries in the in-universe chronology, but by putting it in its production chronology. So I think as a blue uniform, we could think of it as a successor to the Star Trek Enterprise uniforms. But instead of aiming to be kind of mundane like in Enterprise, it's definitely aiming to be striking and attractive. And now, department colors are now completely different, so they're gold, silver, and copper instead of red, yellow, and blue. And they're put onto the side of it, giving the uniform a bit of a more vertical rather than a horizontal look compared to the Enterprise uniforms. And the Starfleet insignia is back. Whereas the Enterprise uniforms had a logo on the sleeve, in Discovery we've got a nice shiny badge version of the TOS era Starfleet insignia. And while this uniform definitely makes a certain amount of sense as a successor to the Star Trek Enterprise uniform, it doesn't make nearly as much sense sitting next to the TOS era uniform, which is kind of ironic because it ends up being used side by side with them in Discovery Season 2. But needless to say, I think it's a very good looking design, and at this point it is the last of our distinct categories of uniforms for our list here. So that's the basic lineup slightly expanded. Now we have the TOS and the 3 TNG derivative uniforms, and we have the red film era uniforms, and we have the NX era Enterprise uniforms, and the shiny Discovery uniforms. But of course, there's more. So now that we've listed the basic lineup of the 4 classic uniforms and then slightly expanded that basic lineup, let's go over the list again a little more carefully, while also adding a more complete list of all the variations. So this final list is going to also include the various TNG-style uniforms that follow the First Contact uniform in new modern Trek, such as Picard, and it's also going to include little one-offs like the motion picture uniform and the various uniforms used in time travel episodes to represent then-future Starfleet. So first off, we got to go back to the beginning. Let's turn back the clock to the beginning of the original Star Trek back in 1966. And turns out those original TOS uniforms actually went through a couple of stages of evolution before we got to the standard ones that we are most familiar with. So first off, we had the version used in the unaired pilot, The Cage. This original variation of the uniform had kind of a turtleneck design going on, and the women wore pants instead of the miniskirt, and the doctor wore this kind of funny blue jumpsuit sort of uniform. They also had these really cool gray landing party sweaters that really give a sense of groundedness to the away team scenes. Makes them feel a little more believable because they look a little more like something you can picture people wearing in some kind of ordinary real life context. And like I said, in that sense, it kind of gives me a similar feeling to the feeling I get from the Star Trek Enterprise uniforms, in that it gives me less of that exciting cartoony Star Trek feeling and more of a sense that I could be watching something from real life. As we move from there to the replacement pilot, where no man has gone before, you may notice that they're still using that turtleneck design, but this time Spock is wearing yellow. And you may also notice the red shirts are still wearing this cream or tan color instead of red. Man, Scotty looks funny wearing cream. And the landing party sweaters are at this point no longer used and will never be seen again. After that, we get these standard TOS uniforms that we know and love. So the turtleneck is gone, the women wear mini skirts, the doctor wears short sleeves, and the colors have been standardized to what we're familiar with command and helm getting yellow, science and medical getting blue, and engineering and security getting red. Kirk also occasionally wears green, but according to Wikipedia, this was actually kind of a mistake, because according to Wikipedia at least, all of the yellow shirts were actually a shade of green that appeared yellow under the lights and then on film, but these green ones were actually just a slightly different shade that ended up looking green on film as well. So it seems that he wasn't ever actually supposed to have a green shirt, and then when they made the animated series in the early 70s, they always colored Kirk's shirt yellow. Anyway, so this classic TOS uniform ended up appearing as a cameo in Deep Space Nine in the episode Trials and Tribulations, when we get to see the DS9 cast wearing TOS uniforms. And there was also a very brief mini cameo in the Enterprise episode In a Mirror Darkly. And then these were also very subtly redesigned for the 2009 film. You'll notice a little bit of texturing, and that it's now a two-layer design with an undershirt. And now the Starfleet insignia is a metal pin instead of just being embroidered onto the shirt. In 2016, for Star Trek Beyond, these were slightly redesigned again, this time with a collar that's a little bit reminiscent of the classic TNG style, and also with a new landing party jacket that reminds me a little bit of Star Trek Enterprise. Then in 2019, the uniforms were redesigned again for Season 2 of Discovery, with adjustments made to the collar and the body of the uniform to give it a little bit more in common with the standard Discovery uniforms, while still maintaining the most noticeable essentials of the TOS design. And then most recently, though I haven't gotten into Strange New Worlds yet myself, a quick Google search suggests that they have slightly redesigned the uniform for Strange New Worlds by giving it a bit of a V-neck design around the collar, and by adding black siding for the women's uniform, and also giving them some really cool looking landing party sweaters in honor of the ones from The Cage. So in conclusion, the TOS uniforms are perhaps the most recognizable and classic of Star Trek uniforms, and therefore have a lot of very subtle variations that remain pretty close to the original. We recognize these classic uniforms by their bright primary colors reflecting the officer's department, by the sleeve stripes reflecting rank, and the simple delta for the Starfleet insignia. So at this point, in some ways, the next logical step would be to go to the Next Generation uniform, but of course we've got the two movie-era uniforms that go in between there. And these are the Motion Picture uniforms and the Wrath of Khan uniforms. The motion picture uniforms are pretty easy to forget, I suppose. Just one solid color and the embroidered Delta insignia with a circle around it. And that circle around it, I suppose, makes it kind of like it's a predecessor to the TNG comm badge. Now, the Admiral uniform in the motion picture, which is what Kirk is wearing, is definitely, I think most of us would agree, it's definitely much better looking than the rest of the standard uniforms in the motion picture lineup. But I think it's pretty universally agreed by fans that these, in general, are some of the most drab-looking uniforms in the whole franchise. Now, one cool thing they did have going on at this point is that they had these handy-dandy wrist communicators instead of the standard TOS flip communicators, but they got rid of those when they moved on to the next film. And then, like I said, another reason we tend to forget about the motion picture uniforms is because the Wrath of Khan uniforms that followed lasted for Star Trek 2 through 6 and Generations, as well as being used a number of times when 24th century characters would time travel to various points in that in-between period. Anyway, so with the Wrath of Khan uniforms, this is the first time we've had an actual badge for the Starfleet insignia, not counting the modernized versions of the TOS uniform that they used in 2009 and following, and not counting the Admiral badge from the motion picture. So first time we have an actual badge, though it wouldn't be an actual communicator badge until the Next Generation launches. Also, sometimes when this uniform is used to represent various timelines, they use it without the turtleneck undershirt, and sometimes they use it with a TNG-style comm badge. Then, as we move on to the TNG-era uniforms, we actually have two different versions of this. A lot of the time we forget about the original draft of the classic TNG uniform, which was a one-piece design and had an additional little colored line up by the collar. But then a couple seasons in, they redesigned it and came up with the one that we're more familiar with, which is a two-piece design with a shirt and pants, and I think most of us would agree kind of just looks better overall. So now that we're in the TNG era, we're back to the multicolor approach like we had in TOS, though this time the red and yellow are switched so that Command and Helm wear red and Security and Engineering wear yellow instead of the other way around. Dr. Crusher wears a lab coat, and for the first time in the series, the Starfleet insignia is now a communicator badge, which will be a tradition that continues for the rest of the series. And then, fun little bit of trivia, there's also this special captain's jacket that was only used in the Season 5 episode Darmok. And, I can't help but wonder if the decision to switch red and yellow could have been inspired partly by the Wrath of Khan uniforms. Kind of like since everybody was wearing red in the Wrath of Khan, I wonder if the creators maybe felt it would kind of look good to keep the captain in red as we move into this new series. Who knows? Anyway, then we get the continued evolution of this design, kind of like I talked about before. We've got the Voyager-style uniforms, which were developed for Deep Space Nine and were used in Deep Space Nine as well as Generations and Voyager. Then we get the First Contact-style uniforms, which were developed for First Contact and were used in Deep Space Nine. They were used in the rest of the TNG films. And in Voyager, the Starfleet headquarters parts that they had near the end of that series also used these uniforms. And also in this era, there's also a special captain's vest uniform that is sometimes worn by Picard in First Contact and is occasionally worn by Sisko in Deep Space Nine. And then here's something kind of fun to think about. So since some of these eras overlap, we end up with some characters getting extra points for wearing almost all of the uniforms. Of the crews, Picard's crew comes out on top for the greatest diversity of uniforms, because Picard and the gang wore both of the TNG uniforms. They wore the Voyager-style uniforms in the film Generations, and then they wore the First Contact uniform for the rest of the films. And then, as if to top it off, Picard also was seen wearing the modified Wrath of Khan uniform in the time travel parts of the episode Tapestry. So, Captain Picard, as far as I'm concerned, gets the award for wearing the most classic uniforms. Captain Sisko gets second place since he wore the classic TNG uniform in DS9's pilot episode, and then he wore the Voyager-style uniform for the first half of the series, and then he's probably most recognized for wearing the First Contact-style uniform for the second half of the series. And then to top it off, he wore a yellow Captain Kirk uniform during Trials and Tribulations, so maybe we can give him the second place prize, having worn one fewer classic uniforms than Captain Picard did. All right, now to fast forward past the silent years of Star Trek to the modern period, I find it interesting that when we get to Star Trek Picard, it's kind of like they basically return to what seemed to be maybe the most loved of the classic Star Trek uniforms, the two final stages of the TNG uniform's evolution, which would be the Voyager uniform and the First Contact uniform. And the main difference between those two uniforms is whether they maintain the multicolor aspect of the yellow, red, or blue tops, or if they make it gray. And like I said, I think this multicolor aspect has come to be very strongly associated with Star Trek in general, being the common thread uniting all the classic uniforms except for the TOS movie era. As a result, for myself at least, I've always felt that the First Contact uniforms are the best looking and the most developed version of that model, but the Voyager uniform kind of feels like the most quote-unquote normal Star Trek of the looks, and the one that I tend to remember the most simply because they were the last of the evolution where you still notice those red, yellow, and blue colors. Anyway, so in that context, for myself at least, I was quite satisfied when Picard launched and they portrayed Starfleet headquarters with people wearing a slightly modified version of the Voyager uniform, and with Picard tending to go around wearing a jacket built around the basic flavor of the First Contact uniform. Of course, we recognize that it's a bit convenient in universe, since this is supposed to be quite a ways down the timeline, but it's still great fun to see designs that feel familiar and feel like they represent the classic Trek universe that I'm the most familiar with. Now, let's fill in some transition points a little bit here. So early on in Picard Season 1, they also introduce a past variation of the design in a flashback scene. So this version would presumably belong to the transition point after the final film and shortly before Picard Season 1. Kind of quirky looking, I suppose, but definitely believable enough. And then presumably immediately before this would have been the Lower Decks uniforms, which are a barely modified kind of transitional form based on the classic TNG style uniform. So the progression then would be that we had the First Contact style uniform, followed by the Lower Decks style uniform, followed by the Picard flashback style uniform, followed by that redesigned Voyager style. And then after that, for Picard Season 2, they actually modified that design a little bit, bringing it a little bit back in the direction of the Lower Decks uniform. So I guess the main difference between the Lower Decks uniform and the Picard Season 2 to 3 uniform would be that the colors are switched top and bottom, and also the use of that Voyager-type undershirt collar instead of the more closed collar design from the Lower Decks uniform. And then in Picard Season 3, they also made ample use of their new dress uniform design. So, then to take it all together, the full evolution of the TNG-style uniform from the beginning ends up being pretty lengthy. So we've got the original one-piece TNG uniform, followed by the standard, most recognized TNG uniform. Then we've got the Voyager/early DS9 style colored top uniform, followed by the First Contact or later DS9 style gray top uniform. And then moving into the silent years, we've got the Lower Decks black top uniform, followed by the Picard flashback colored top. And then the really nice Picard Season 1 open collar design that was unfortunately pretty short-lived, followed quickly by the Picard Seasons 2 to 3 design with kind of a Lower Decks looking flap and with a kind of Voyager-style collar. Anyway, so that's the official sequence there. But really for myself, honestly, I don't normally think of Star Trek Picard in terms of continuing the evolution of the TNG uniform, though of course that happens, but I tend to think of it more as them returning to the ones that we're already familiar with and just adjusting them slightly. And I think it was really important for the success of Picard that it tapped into the feel that this was the same kind of Star Trek we're familiar with, in contrast to what was done in Star Trek Enterprise on the one hand and in Discovery on the other hand. I think, for myself at least, I really think that they made a very good decision among their other very good decisions by just bringing back the uniforms we were the most familiar with, since the Star Trek uniform is a pretty strong subliminal cue that this is Star Trek that you're watching. And I think the primary color tops are an important part of that, even though we do recognize that they kind of take us a step away from reality, since in real life you don't generally go around seeing a lot of bright yellows, reds, and blues unless you're browsing the toys section at Walmart. But that said, Star Trek isn't just about realism. It has developed a life of its own, and the classic primary color palette of uniforms is part of that tradition. All right, now here's something else interesting. One of the little bits of contradiction that we kind of politely wink at as Star Trek fans, or at least I do, when we see the uniform choices from Star Trek Picard, is how much of a radical departure it is from the earlier reportage that we got about what the future of Starfleet was supposed to look like. Starting with the closing episode of The Next Generation, All Good Things, we got to see the future of Starfleet uniforms a number of times via time travel. And needless to say, that future doesn't look at all like the uniforms that we end up seeing in Star Trek Picard. But this design was not only the predicted future for when Picard would get on into his elderly years, but this was also supposed to be the future for when Bashir and Dax would get into their elderly years around the same time, as well as for when Janeway and Reg Barclay would get into their elderly years around the same time. It's a pretty consistent future Starfleet uniform, and it's great fun to see it popping up with such consistency in all the time travel episodes in 90s Star Trek. Though let's be honest, we're all a little bit glad that no one decided to make a whole television series with all the characters only wearing these funny-looking costumes. And that's not all we've seen of the future of Starfleet. So in Voyager, we also got a glimpse of the 29th century Starfleet, the version of Starfleet when exploring the final frontier no longer means the exploration of space, but actually primarily the exploration and management of time. So Captain Braxton and friends wear quite different-looking Starfleet uniforms, a bit dull-looking, I suppose you could say. You might almost forget they're actually Starfleet. And we get a similar world with the world of Crewman Daniels in Star Trek Enterprise, but this time it's the 31st century. And normally we just see Daniels wearing his standard Enterprise uniform until we get to see this. I'm not sure if that's actually a uniform or just something really weird, but there it is. And then last of all, the last point of history is when we get a glimpse of Starfleet in the 32nd century after The Burn, which is in Discovery Season 3. And you could say these uniforms look a little more recognizably Starfleet than what we saw of the Daniels era, but still quite a bit different from what we're used to. Anyway, so that's all the standard Starfleet uniforms throughout the history of the saga, not including dress uniforms, admiral uniforms, or cadet uniforms, and also not including alien uniforms like Bajoran or Romulan, and also not including Mirror Universe uniforms or alternate timeline uniforms. Also, I never mentioned that one-off uniform used in Star Trek 2009 for the period between Star Trek Enterprise and the TOS era. But that being said, I think I've succeeded in listing the standard Starfleet uniforms from all the various time periods of the canon film and television Star Trek universes, and then trying to line them up in something of a tidy fashion. For myself, my favorites still tend to be the two uniforms that concluded the evolution of the classic TNG design. So the Voyager uniforms and the First Contact uniforms. Those ones still remain my favorites, with the First Contact uniform being the one that I tend to think of as the best looking of the classic designs, and with the Voyager design being the one that just feels the most like quote-unquote normal Star Trek to me. I like the Discovery uniforms, but I'm not that big a fan of the Discovery series, so I don't tend to think about those uniforms a whole lot, especially since they don't fit super well into the timeline. And I really do think that the return to the classic style that we saw in Picard Seasons 1 and 2 was really one of the best things that could have been done visually for those of us who love the classic 24th century Star Trek universe. Anyway, so what about you? What's your favorite uniform? And let me know as well, let me know in the comments if there's something I missed as well, if you agree or if you disagree about which uniforms come to the top of the pile, which ones are the best and the worst, etc., stuff like that. But anyway, thanks for sticking around, have a great day, and of course, live long and prosper.